So hi everyone, my name is Dan, and today I'll be introducing three speakers who are going to talk to you about making sense of the world with our senses and our tools. So let me just share my screen real quickly. Can everyone see my screen? Yes? Okay, cool. So as I said, we're going to be talking about making sense of the world with our senses and our tools. So let me briefly introduce the speakers before I actually introduce the topic. So just a second. Ugh. Sorry, I'm having some issues. Give me 1 second. There we go. So first up is going to be Charles Lomba, whose department is physics, and his research is understanding polymer organization and assembly. And his fun fact is that he's ambidextrous. Then after that, we'll have Sadie-Marie Wong-Si-Kwie talk about something else, but I'll get to that in a second. But her department is neuroscience, and her research is neural networks that support emotional regulation in children. And her fun fact is that she's from the Netherlands. I think from Rotterdam. So, and then finally we have Evan Cudone, who is from the Department of Computational Biology and Bioinformatics. And his research is about informatics and computational neuroscience. And his fun fact is that he has a cat named Apricot. So now that you've met all of our speakers, at least in some way, I can introduce the topic. So every day we're bombarded by endless streams of information, whether it's auditory information, visual information, smell information, taste information, touch information, all sorts of information. If we actually took every single stimulus completely seriously and paid a lot of attention to it, we wouldn't be able to do anything or get ahead with our day. So there's got to be some way that our brains manage to sort of filter out what's important and filter out what's not important and filter in what is important. And we sort of are able to make sense of information. So today's talks broadly are going to focus on how our brains make sense of information. And then once we understand how our brains make sense of information, we'll be able to talk a little bit about how we can teach machines or computers to interpret information, specifically language information, for us. So let me just briefly introduce the first talk before we get started. So really, before we understand how we can make sense of information in our brains, we have to understand how order arises in general in the natural world. And the best place to start is in nature. You know, in nature, you have atoms becoming molecules, molecules becoming, macroscopic substances, and, macroscopic substances potentially forming things like crystals and other types of matter that we can actually see. And again, in order to understand how we make sense of the world, it really makes sense to see how the world makes sense of itself. And that's kind of what Charles is going to be talking about. So without further ado, here's Charles.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can everyone see my mouse on the screen as well?
Yes.
All right. All right. So today I'm going to talk about how atomic scale wonders give rise to the properties we see in everyday life. So without further ado, here, let's go. The first thing I introduce you to is this photo of a giant clam. And, just whenever you look at the world, things strike out at you. Maybe it's the texture of the shell, the shape of the shell, the size of it. This is a giant clam. So this would be about, 10 centimeters across to 30 centimeters across. But what's most striking about this, I think, is the color patterns. You see here greens to yellows deep into the shell. And just generally, when we look at the world, we see a myriad of colors and everything. These flowers, from reds to yellows to greens in the leaves to other species of purples. And then as you look around, you see the blue sky, you see the white snow. If you look at different species, you'd see different color furs and different texturing of everything. Um, and everyone I think has experienced a nice sunset. And here again, you see the sky once was a bright clear blue, now has all these reds and purple hues, along with other things are man-made, like these yellow amber cornfields in the background here. So what exactly are we seeing? What are we perceiving? And well, first we have to start with what we are seeing is light. Light is a wave, like ripples on the ocean, or if you ever do that CrossFit, whenever you send a pulse sending down the string and a part here moves and it travels along, that's exactly what happens to this phenomenon called light. And light interacts with the atoms and molecules that he talked about before, just naturally, just how you are attracted to the earth. When you jump, you come down, light interacts with your molecules. And atoms are the particles that make up the world. So light interacts strongly with everything we see. And to do a little bit more visualization of it here, we would zoom in and we'd see a wave instead of water of this electric field, and conversely a magnetic field. And defining this wave would be a wavelength difference between these points here, and also an amplitude, how strong the wave is. And we don't need to get into the details of what electric and magnetic fields are, but the same electricity that powers your devices and the magnets that will stick to your fridge. So now we need to talk about atoms. These are the building blocks of things we see in the world. They come etymologically from the words atomos, meaning uncuttable. It was philosophized in the Greek times. If you just watched the riverbank and you would see the rocks erode, and things are little, tiny, smaller until one point you couldn't see them, and then you couldn't make them any smaller. That's what they imagined the concept was. What they didn't quite understand was maybe the complexity of what made up the world, how we have actually 118 different types of atoms that make up all the substances we see. It might start maybe as a basis of some element of like water, fire, earth, and air, but we've characterized a lot of them. And there are actually 92 that are occurring on Earth, and we've actually made all of them in laboratories. So example, these elements are oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen. You might have heard of helium and balloons. And what's unique about atoms, they form bond with each other to make the next basic unit of matter, molecules. And I like to think of these as just different types of Legos. So there's like these 3 Legos, there's these longer Legos, and they all fit with each other differently. They fit with themselves in different ways, and that gives rise to a lot of properties we see. And just to give you a length scale, they are about 0.1 nanometers. So the light we were talking about was about 400 to 700 nanometers. And to give you a sense of that, if you took your hair and shrunk it down a factor of 100, you would see what light looks like. And if you went from there and went to another factor of 1,000, you'd start getting to the scale of these atoms. So they're quite small. And so when we start thinking about things like color, it's a process of where you have light and different wavelengths correspond to different colors that we perceive. So longest 700 wavelengths being red, and then the shorter ones being purples. And they are incident across a lot of things, and they come back and then come into your RI. And in the back of our eye, they activate our cells in there, which are the building blocks of life. And they make a signal that's interpreted by the brain. And later speaker of ours will talk more about that perception pathway with a different sense, but it's quite intriguing, and it's very wonderful that we can perceive all these colors and sights in the world. And if you've painted or you shine different color lights, you see this thing where if you make a red light and you combine blue light, you get purples, and if you combine different things like green and red, you get yellows. So there's like there's definitely an ordering of pigments in the world where different colors combine to make up the complexities of colors we see. And we actually see that in flowers a lot. So each of these are different types of pigment colors that are common to flowers that give rise to the colors. Here's its molecular structure. And what this illustrates here is that, for example, in the carotenoids, or things that we typically think of as orange yellows, actually tend to reflect most of the colors that are along here and absorb a lot of the colors that are darker. And conversely, when you think of things that here, these UV absorbing flavonoids, they reflect pretty much every single color and that's why they show up as white. And if you start zooming into the scale here and take a petal and you look in, you see these cells that are covered in these colored pigments. And that's actually quite analogous to this one right here, which is a crayon actually. So the only thing that changes here is really the texture, but it's still, instead of the flower and cells, you have wax surrounding it, but now you have a red pigment here that gives rise to the color. And so now we might think of then things about why is the sky blue, right? And it's actually, not quite as simple as it being full of these pigment colors like a flower, because if you hold up air right in front of me, there's nothing really there. It's really not that dense, and this should be maybe as blue as something else, right? As you chip away a crayon, it doesn't get less, for example, red. So it turns out, we're going to answer this question. It turns out nature doesn't always use pigments as well. If you start zooming in on this macaw photo here, and you looked at one of these little tiny feather units, and you zoomed in here, and then you zoomed in one more scale here to about 2 microns, you see all these little dark spots that represent the proteins in here. And if you shine light in here, for example, now you see light would start being misdirected in all different types of way. And it turns out this is a similar mechanism to what happens in the sky, where you have colors, maybe reds and yellows, the longer wavelengths, versus the shorter ones, blues, being allowed to go without its path bending as much as like the shorter ones is blue and green. And the 2 prominent examples of this are Rayleigh scattering, which gives rise to the sky, where the red, yellows, and greens go right through, versus the blues scatter all up in the sky. And that's why when you look at the sky, the sun looks a little bit more reds and orange versus as opposed to blue sky. And also the Tyndall effect, where if you have a solution and you put stuff in there, like you can do this with milk or flour and water, and you start visualizing the particles. And if you looked at, say, flour and water, it looks blue. Or same thing happens at when you look at smog, it might look blue, because the little particles coming out from the smog actually do have the similar effect. And this is something you can safely try at home and experience the sky almost in your house. So this is why the sky now looks blue, because we have light coming in, it's being misdirected in all ways. And then when you're at sunset, when you're at a longer angle between the sun and you, it actually gives a chance for the reds to actually spread out a lot more too than just the blues. And similarly to that, this is also why we might perceive eyes as blue. When you have less of the pigmentation that gives maybe darker eye color, you actually get this scattering effect and the blue, the color predominating. And now we'll come back to clams. They're quite cool, a vast array of colors. And as we zoom in here, we start seeing these cells. And when they were analyzed, you start seeing, again, light coming in, certain colors like orange is transmitting most through versus green scattering out. And it turns out that allows the deeper light to go into the shell, and that allows it to live symbiotically within the organism. So without this complex optical design and the colors we in turn see as a consequence of that, these clams would have a harder time making its food with its organism that it cohabitates with. So just to kind of show the example here. And one of the part and crucial to this exploration are things such as microscopes, where something that allows an object to be magnified for our viewing. This can be done both with light we see and other particles to get a higher zoom, and also things like reflectometers, which through this complex setup, light is allowed to go through and go onto a sample, and you can measure how much light is coming back out at you at different wavelengths. And with that, that kind of concludes what I wanted to tell everyone about. So between these different properties, we actually start, and the ability to zoom in using tools like microscopes, we start getting a different understanding of the world we live in. And with that, our next presenter will talk to you about a different sense.
Thank you, Charles. So it's very interesting. Definitely think about how our brain processes that light and how we still see different colors. I think that's a great bridge also to my presentation. There you go. My screen okay and everything? Great. Well, hi everyone. My name is Sadie-Marie, and today I'll be talking about the nostalgia of music, and specifically how we go from sound to something that is so incredibly meaningful to all of us. So first off, let's look at the definition of nostalgia. It's a feeling that we all kind of know. It can be prompted by any of our senses. It could be a smell, it could be a sound, or a familiar place, but they can all provoke that familiar feeling of a sentimental longing or a visual affection for the past. So just something small can all of a sudden open up a world full of memories and transport us back in time. Like I said, there's different senses involved, but the one we'll be focusing on today is music. So it will be our ears and our hearing. So let's start off with some great news. Musical nostalgia is good for you. Research has been done and they found that listening to music that provokes nostalgia helps create feelings of social connectedness, helps with feelings of youthfulness and optimism, as well as increasing people's self-esteem, making them realize or re-realize the meaning of life, and above all, inspire them for new ideas. So that's what we'll be focusing on. So let's reflect on the process that just happened. We all heard the music, we all heard the song, regardless if we know it or not, the audio all hit all of our ears. Then there were a select few who recognized the music, like Mr. and Mrs. Gruber, I'm sorry. And they recognized the song and they knew its name, but they don't really had any specific personal associations or meaning related to it, but they nonetheless recognized the song. And then when we look at Barb, she indeed confirmed that she started feeling nostalgic. For her, if just hearing this audio brought back memories from growing up in the 80s and memories from when she was in school. And this is a process that we'll be looking at today. So we'll be looking at how we go from hearing to recognizing and ultimately feeling nostalgia with our central star, the brain. So the focus of today will be what happens in your brain. So in the next few minutes, I will be explaining what happens in a matter of milliseconds in our brain as soon as we press play. So first off, hearing the music. Music is created by an ensemble of instruments and vocal cords. There are different instruments and each of them produces their own sound waves. So essentially sound is nothing more than vibrations that go through the air. And that's kind of what you can see here in the picture. So each individual instrument and each person with their vocal cords, even me speaking right now, produces their own sound waves or air vibrations. So hidden in these air vibrations is a lot of information. One part of information that we can detect in it is its volume. Depending on how hard your computer is, some people heard it very loudly when I played the song, others didn't hear it as clearly. Then there's the pitch of the music. Whoa, my bad. Then there's the pitch of the music, the rhythm of the music, and ultimately the lyrics. So all of this information is really basically just hidden, so to say, in nothing but air vibrations. Yet when it reaches our ears, we can decouple it and interpret all of this meaning behind it. So let's look at what happens in our ear. So here you see the same sound waves and they travel to your ear and they go throughout your ear to what we call the middle ear. And the first place that they hit is the eardrum. So the eardrum is a small membrane, here pictured in blue, that kind of vibrates along with this incoming sound waves. And that's the first point really where the sound interacts with our body. So the movement of the eardrum subsequently creates a movement in the inner ear. Here are very, very tiny bones, as you can see in the picture. Very tiny bones are connected and they further carry on these vibrations that have been caused by the moving of the eardrum. So the movement of the inner ear then ultimately reaches the cochlea. This is a snail-shaped structure that is filled with fluid. And if we zoom in on it on a microscopic level, we can actually see that inside of it, there are nerve endings. So here, the little kind of hair-like structures that you see in red are nerve endings. And these nerve endings then translate the movement that is created by the sound wave and by the vibrations. They translate these into electrical signals. And these electrical signals are then brought to the brain through the auditory nerve. So really what our brain deals with in terms of information are electrical signals. So before we enter the brain, there's something important that I need to explain to you for you to best understand the rest of, best understand the brain and best understand the rest of my talk today. So when we hear of the brain, we often hear of brain areas. This brain area is responsible for A, this brain area is responsible for B, which is generally true. However, if we really look at it, it's almost saying like, we're listening to a song, but we can only hear two of its instruments. We know that there's a saxophonist and we know there's someone with a string instrument, but we only hear the individual chords that they play. If we just hear someone play their chords, we cannot really understand exactly what song it is. We just have their piece of the puzzle. So to better understand brain areas, which are in a similar way, we need to know and understand that these brain areas are in communication with each other and they work together. So really, when we think about how the brain functions, we think of neural networks or brain networks. And these networks are how different parts of the brain work together. So to take it back to our band, it's now looking instead of at just these two individual instruments, we're really looking at how these come together to play a song. So that is a network. A network is a collection of different brain areas, just like a band is a collection of different people with different instruments. And ultimately, we have various networks in our brain, and these networks can come together to create systems. So there are functions that each of these networks have through which they can kind of help with one specific function or one specific ability within our brains. So if we now look at it in terms of the same analogy, we go from individual instruments to an entire band that can ultimately give rise to one song or one specific sound altogether. So this analogy will be the backdrop for the rest of my presentation today, and I will be specifically focusing on the networks and the systems that are involved with the process of first hearing the music, then recognizing the music, and ultimately feeling nostalgia. So first off, we left off by the auditory nerve translating the sound wave, or bring the sound waves that have been translated in electrical signals and bring them to the brain. So the first place where it actually hits your brain is this area, which is the primary auditory cortex, here pictured in the middle in pink. And it's part of the auditory system. So what this specific area does is to just process the basic sounds of music. So it is at first it recognizes that there is even an incoming sound, which is important, and B, it assesses the volume and the pitch of those incoming sounds. It also sends signals to other brain areas. That's why I didn't just color the pink area, but you see different colors. So I will be taking you through these various structures. So other parts of music that we can dissect are the music's melody, the rhythm, and the timing that is in the music. Those are all components that we kind of keep track of when we hear music. And two structures that are engaged with that are the cerebellum, which is located at the lower back of your end, so kind of where my bun is right now, and then the motor cortex, which is around here. And the motor cortex, as it's hidden in its name, is involved with movement. So that is, for example, the reason why we start tapping along. We're kind of swaying left and right once we hear music, and that is almost automatic. And the cerebellum is also involved with a lot of processes, but in case of listening to music, is more so involved with keeping track of the rhythm and timing. So most music that we listen to has lyrics, so we will also need to process the language that comes with the music, and that occurs in the blue and green area here, and those are respectively Broca's and Wernicke's areas. And as I mentioned, these together are responsible for language processing, specifically one of them for language comprehension, so allowing you to understand the lyrics, and on the other hand, language production, so you can sing along with the words that you're hearing. And lastly, because music is sound in general, but also music is very complex, we also need much more advanced sound processing. We need to recognize which instruments are going on. If we heard the song before, we need to recognize if this may be associated to a movie. So all of this complex and advanced sound processing occurs in these two areas. Those are the supramarginal and the angular gyri. And those who are more responsible for the complex sound processing. So this is where we now move into the recognition phase, because we have seen this is how our brain technically just hears the sound, but the sound does have meaning yet at this point. We just heard it. So let's look at the process of recognizing the music. So for recognizing the music, the memory system is primarily involved. And as you can see here, these are two structures. However, memories are stored all throughout the brain. There is no specific area or structure or kind of no one bookshelf where all of your memories are stored. Memories are all throughout the brain. However, there are two key important structures for it. First one being the hippocampus. You could see this as almost the librarian of your brain. It's a seahorse-shaped structure that is kind of in the middle of your brain. And similarly to a librarian, it's responsible for the filing away of your memories, as well as the retrieval of your memories. So as soon as we hear the music, this structure is kind of going to run around and look around. What do I already know about this? What information do I already have? So within the context of memory, the amygdala is important for the emotional intensity of the memories that we have. And because these two structures are so closely linked to each other, that is also the reason why very emotional memories are often better remembered and also longer remembered. So that is something also that matters for why meaningful music is music that we remember for a long time, and that's very nostalgic to us. So further, I will break down the memory system on a cognitive level. And when we look at nostalgia, it's specifically important to look at long-term memory, because it often is about music we haven't heard in a long while. In this case, it was a song from the 80s. So definitely it needs to be deeply in our mind to remember that it's there. So on the one hand, we have our explicit memory. Our explicit memory are the memories that we can actively call to mind and that are part of our conscious memory. So the things we can actually think of, visualize, and vocalize, that is our explicit memory. So on the one hand, this consists of all of your learned knowledge and all the concepts that you've learned. So the fact that music even is music, or what a certain instrument is, or in the context of what just happened, specifically the song title and the artist's name. So in this case, Time After Time by Cyndi Lauper. Now, what is behind all of these other boxes is mostly informative for our understanding of feeling nostalgia and the broader context of nostalgia. So that is what we'll be focusing on next. Feeling nostalgic. So we still stay with the explicit memory, but in addition to knowledge and concepts, there are our experienced events. So these are everything we've been through and all of the information that is relevant to ourselves and our experiences. And in this case, as Barb mentioned, for her, that was her high school period. This is the reason why as soon as she heard it, she had to think back about being in school in the 80s. Now, on the other hand, there is the implicit memory. These are things that do not actively come to mind. We cannot really focalize or actively think of the fact that we heard this, but still it is all stored within us and within our memory. So one part of that is skills and actions. And in the context of listening to music, that could look like kind of muscle memory. So if you haven't played an instrument in a long time, but you heard it again, you instantly still remember how to play or how the chords go. Or if you did a dance routine 20 years ago, but you hear it now, still your one special dance, or for example, your wedding dance, could come back to you as soon as you hear the music. And lastly, within implicit memories are associated emotions. So all of the emotions that are associated with the memories and the concepts and the events that you that are stored in your memory, they also have a specific emotion related to them, which is where the amygdala, the small yellow structure that we just saw, comes into play. So this is ultimately where we reach feeling nostalgia. when we look further into feeling nostalgic, it involves the motion system. And as you can see, these are a lot of structures that are involved in this, and I won't be breaking them down one by one. But I just wanted to show you the complexity that goes into our brain generating our emotions. So within the field, we call this the limbic system. And as I mentioned, this entire system is responsible for the generation of most of our emotions, or almost all of our emotions, as well as the processing of the emotions that we see of others and our own emotions. So one specific thing that's important in the context of feeling nostalgia is that listening to nostalgic music stimulates the reward system. It creates positive emotions and a desire to keep on listening to this music, and it will make you feel good. But as we all know, nostalgia is a bittersweet feeling, because on the one hand, we have this activation of the reward system that makes it very rewarding and it makes you feel good to listen to this music. But on the other hand, it's also bittersweet because there comes this ultimate realization that these are times of the past, times that we can never return back to. And this ultimately, this balance and back and forth between, on the one hand, the amazing memories and the positive emotions associated with those memories on the one hand, and on the other hand, this sentimental feeling of what's in the past has been. So just to recap before we end off, in the process that just happened, when we play music, our auditory system kicks in. It makes sure that we can hear and process all of the sounds that we're hearing. Next, the memory system allows us to recognize this music. And the same memory system is also the reason why we ultimately feel nostalgia together with our emotion system. So, as I started off with, my main takeaway from you is all of this complexity within the brain. The main thing that is important to you is that musical nostalgia is good for you. So keep on playing your favorite song, keep dancing around, keep singing along in the shower, and keep, just keep building on all of these positive traits that it has. But before you run off, or before you start thinking too much about what or which songs provoke this feeling for you, we got one more talk by Evan, and he will be talking to you about how the brain processes, how computers process complex information. Because we just saw that the brain does this and has all of these areas that are involved. However, to teach something so complex to a computer is a bit more than BCI. So up next is Evan. Thank you for your time.
All right, can everyone hear me? I will take.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so my name is Evan, and my talk today is going to be about how computers learn language. Starting off with the talks you just heard about how information is processed at different scales and then how it's processed by the brain, I will be sharing about how we can use what we learn about this information at all these different places and incorporate that into our computational systems such that they can help us out specifically with learning language. So first, I need to start off with computers think in numbers. So everything that is on your computer, every single picture, every single video is all encoded in numbers. When a computer sees this picture of a horse, at each and every single one of these pixels is what's called a hex code. One of these codes right here. And so, for instance, this seafoam green is represented as this hex code, which alludes to the specific light that's involved in that color, which can be encoded in the computer as this long list of numbers. This hex code system is really useful because it allows us to get more than 16 million different colors, and that is sufficient to see every single video, every single picture, anything on your computer. So when we think about encoding language in computers, it might it might be reasonable to start off where colors left off, and that is encoding it also as numbers. Now, there are only 171,000 unique words in the dictionary, so we could reasonably start from the very beginning, a base, and so on, and just number them off one by one. Now, people tried this, but it turns out there's a lot of complexity. So unlike colors as they're represented in your computer, where a one-to-one code does a really good job of representing that color at each pixel, language has a lot of complexity, including semantics, syntax, context, and the fact that it's constantly evolving. So to start us off, I want to share with you some of these complexities such that I can really convince you that we need more challenging algorithms to really to figure this out. So first, the major complexity of language is called semantics, which is the branch of linguistics regarding the meaning around words. And we can really quickly come into some conflicts in the semantics of language. For instance, the panda eats shoots and leaves. I highlighted these two words, shoots and leaves, because they both have some conflicting meanings to them. Shoots can be like Kobe Bryant shooting basketball. It could be like shoots of bamboo. Likewise, leaves can be leaves on a tree, or someone leaving a restaurant or something. So there's lots of conflicting semantics to various words that would mean that a single numbering system like we had with colors, a single hex code, wouldn't really work. Also, syntax adds a lot of complexity to language. So syntax is the rules in which we use to assemble language. So there are hard rules like grammar. And we also see that there's really small complexities here that can have drastic differences in the meanings of the language we're using. For instance, the sentence, the panda eats shoots and leaves, without this comma, versus the sentence, the panda eats, comma, shoots and leaves, have very two different meanings. One is describing what the panda eats in its diet, the other describing a ridiculous situation where a panda eats and then shoots and then leaves. Also, there are a lot of implicit rules to language that make it highly complex. So one of these that I think is my favorite is adjectives, the words that we use to describe nouns, have very specific ordering to them, whether you're aware of it or not. So this is kind of an implicit rule where it's not technically wrong if it's mixed up, but it does sound weird. To elucidate this, I have this example here. The tall green giant or the green tall giant. Now, one of these sounds a little better than the other, and that's because the adjectives are in a very specific order. Also, language is complex because it has constant amounts of context it needs to consider. For instance, in this talk here, I have my intentions, what I want to explain to you in this talk. You have your perceptions, what you're constantly thinking. Hopefully you're not bored right now. And we also have some shared prior knowledge. We both have to understand what language is, what a computer is, and so on. And so all of this is also tied into language and is key to a computer knowing it. And then lastly, language is hard because it's evolving. Ever since hominids first started talking, thousands and thousands of years ago, language has evolved into the many different languages that are spoken now. Also, it's continually evolving. As many of you may have come across some interesting language on Twitter or on various social media platforms. And that brings me to what we call in the field NLP, or natural language processing. So this is the field around getting computers to learn language in the same ways that humans do. And it's really useful for creating a lot of tools that we use, as well as analyzing language. So to kind of start us off on how a computer might learn language, I wanted to present you with this, this example. I'm going to read these sentences, and I want you to try to figure out what they're about. Acerola is a significant source of vitamin C. The pulp of acerola is very soft. Acerola are now found growing in the most subtropical regions of the world. Acerola can be eaten fresh or used to make jams or jellies. Now, if you were like me when I was making these slides, you don't know what the word acerola is off the top of your head. It's not a common thing in the US. But hopefully from listening to these 4 sentences, you can kind of get a good guess of what you're actually, what I'm actually talking about. It's probably a fruit, it's probably sweet, maybe a bit sour, it's nutritious, maybe resembles a cherry or an orange. All of this information you can get from these 4 sentences. And you'd be right, this is what an acerola looks like. Now, when a computer sees this word acerola, it sees it as this long list of numbers, just like as a hex code. Now, of course, this long list of numbers is completely obtuse. It means nothing to a human looking at it. But this vector, or this list of numbers, I'll refer to it as a vector from now on out, is the precise coordinates of the word acerola in this computer's larger understanding of language. So, like all of these various different regions that Sadie-Marie pointed out, interact with different parts of sound and music, this here is like a coordinate system that points directly in the piece of the computer's brain to the meaning of acerola. And this coordinate system, this vector, exists in a larger language embedding, which is basically the whole understanding of language that a computer has. And it might look something like this. So here we have a lot of words in this space over here. And if we look closely, like these ones that are circled, we notice that these words have similar meanings. So like quarter pound, beef chicken gravy, pork veal, quart and pint. All of these words that are really close to each other hopefully have some tied meaning semantically, syntactically, or otherwise. Now, to get to this point, to get to this language embedding, we have to teach the computer language. And the way we do this is we set up these little games for the computer to play. So for instance, we presented this sentence: acerola can be blank, fresh, or used to make jams or jellies. And we ask it to fill in this word. So let's say the computer guesses eaten, thrown, or served. The way it does this is it takes each of the vectors for each of the surrounding words. So for acerola, fresh, make, jams, and jellies, it takes all of these vectors and sends it through this, system called a deep neural network, which is basically a really complex math function, and it outputs a new vector that's supposed to represent the word in the blank. The way we assess whether it did a good job is we do a little bit of arithmetic on the vectors themselves. So for instance, if we have eaten here as the guess and eaten as the correct word, we look at the distance at each and every single one of these points. So 6 and 6, the distance is 0. 0 and 0, the distance is 0. 1 and 1 is 0. We get all of these distances and we can add them up and give it a score. So here, if the has the minimum distance of 0, it gets a gold star and it got it correctly. We can do the same for thrown and served, and we find that thrown has a distance of 17 and served has a distance of 4. Now, if you notice, if you read the sentence with these other two words, acerola can be thrown fresh or used to make jams or jellies, that one doesn't really make any sense. Acerola can be served fresh or used to make jams or jellies. That one makes a lot more sense. And so we notice that here, this distance allows us to kind of assess how good of a fit. Thrown is a bad fit. Served is an okay fit, and eaten is a perfect fit. All of that together, we notice that these distances make sense here in our language embedding. So here for our sentence, we notice that eaten and acerola are quite close to each other, while served might be farther away and thrown is very far away. If we do a really good job and we create a really well-made language embedding, we can apply some arithmetic to language, which I think is really cool and is under great study in computational linguistics. So for example, here, we could look at king and queen. Now, if we look at the transformation between the vector king and the vector queen, it might resemble the same sort of transformation between man and woman. Likewise, the vector transformation between singular nouns like king and kings will be the same vector transfer, the same transformation between the vector queen and queens. And so this is applying some amount of arithmetic to language that is only capable with these sorts of language embeddings. And the result is we can use those embeddings to help us with all sorts of different things, like machine translation, as we see in Google Translate, question answering like IBM Watson, natural language assistants like Siri, Alexa, Google Assist, Cortana, autocomplete, and text generation. But to get here, we have to add a lot more complexity to these sorts of systems. So I explained something kind of how a language embedding is used, but there's a lot more that people can add to it. One of these complexities is what's called long distance dependencies. So here we have two sentences, acerola are sweet and a bit sour. They are delicious and nutritious. Here the word they is referring to the acerola of the previous sentence. So more sophisticated systems will be able to identify these long-term dependencies and allow the computer to locate precisely the correct vector for each of these words. And then lastly, I wanted to share with you what I think is some of the cooler technologies that's coming out of this field, and that is DALL-E out of OpenAI. So what this is, it's a shared language embedding, so like that big coordinate system of words, with a shared image embedding, enabling anyone to write any sentence like a painting of a capybara sitting in a field at sunrise, and it automatically generates out of the ether a picture of a capybara sitting in a field at sunrise. So all of these images here are generated from the computer, which I think is really cool. And so I really recommend you go and look up DALL-E spelled like this. There's a bunch of examples, and it's a really cool technology that came out very recently. And so in summary, when a computer sees the word like acerola, first it vectorizes it, then it uses those vectors to create a language embedding. And then from that language embedding, we can use that to enable a lot of various other technologies like Translate, like assistance and question answering like IBM Watson. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much.